I'd like to make a few concluding remarks about the readings you've just done in Monsters by David Gilmour. A few things to say about monsters. Let's make 5 big points and try to tie them into some of the larger themes which you've looked at so far. So the bigger issue on this book is, what is a monster? And of course, why is a monster? So when we talk about what a monster is, it is a mixture of human and animal. And it needs to be. There's some point of a monster that you need to identify with because the monster is within. And plus, what monsters do can't be too counterintuitive. Remember the counterintuitive ideas that we began the course with? They have to be minimally counterintuitive. Thus, what monsters do are, in many respects, what people can do too, but extraordinarily, in extraordinary ways, right? Their strengths are just magnified. Their viciousness sometimes is magnified over what typical human beings do. True? So remember, these are still counterintuitive concepts, simply because the monster exists within. And the idea of the monster, and when we dwell and when we speak of these things in narratives, they're done under context in which there's fear, going to the horror movies. And this actually creates a psychological context in which the archetype of that monster becomes alive and is generated by the super id. So let's continue on point number 2. Monsters embody all that is dangerous and horrible in the human imagination. So will they embody you? Whatever comes from your imagination doesn't come externally. It's produced through you. So any of the evil ideas or bad things that you think about, they're not about you thinking about things out in the world. They're things about in your mind that exist in your head. And the problem is that does produce guilt. Right? Those run counter to the foundations on which society is built on the morals. Right? And sometimes we repress those things, and when we really should bring them to the surface and destroy them. Right? And that's what this book is really about. And that's what Gilmour was trying to get at. Okay. So really, monsters represent the dark forces of the id. That's really point number 3. They represent the dark forces of the id. Right? And these can be unhealthy forces. And they can also be things which can be disabilitating for our society when people begin themselves to behave like monsters. And we need a way in which to bring those to the surface and conquer those and valorize our own selves as we grow through life towards individuation. So this is how this thing sort of moves with the Jungian cycle. Okay? So number 4, and I think I've mentioned this in what I've been talking about. They are both a source of self-identification and a vehicle for self-punishment. And that is why we kill them off. See, we slay our own dragons by producing those dragons. Those dragons are us, right? And we have to think about the European dragon. What is this European dragon? It lives in a cave. It has things it can't use. It keeps things like virgins and gold. None of them it can use. It just hoards to have and mine. So the idea of going in that cave is going in the subconscious. And slaying that dragon is like slaying yourself, and rising above it, coming to terms with it. Right? So number 5, as I've said so far, monsters are ourselves and our super id. Right? This is the one that David Gilmour sort of looks at. We're looking at another psychological process that you really didn't identify, the super id, conjures these things up. It actually creates the actual monster in form, in a culturally acceptable and shared form, right? And that way, it kind of morally empowers ourselves over the dark forces in the subconscious. When we bring this monster together and realize where the evil is at, we actualize it. And then we see action taken by our heroes to slay it. That takes us on that road to salvation, actually, with them. The game is always in here, right? And the metaphor of the myths, these myths we build, monsters myths, helps us overcome ourselves in a transformative process. And it's very similar psychological processes to the myths in which religion sort of creates. In fact, myths of monsters and myths of religion are sort of complementary. They have a sense of duality, and they both sort of function together. Now, later on, we'll be returning to monsters, but in a different form. We'll be looking at wildmen, which may have a slightly different function than monsters do or not. So we will contrast and compare those a little bit later in the course.